The Signal is not just a conveyor of information, but a champion for the community.
People need to have a town crier. They need to have somebody that is going to tell them unbiased news and what's happening around town.
The Signal has been an important part of my life since we moved out here in '73.
It is the eyes and ears of everything that's going on in the community.
The Signal was something that I was told was a requirement. You have to subscribe to the Signal. That's the only way you're ever going to find out what's going on in town.
The interesting part about our Signal is it was created literally a few months after World War I. Our valley was just a little, rail stop, so to speak. There's a couple thousand people, a few telephones.
Its first issue was published February 7, 1919. First owner was a man, Edward Brown. Ed Brown was a World War I veteran, suffered terribly from mustard gas poisoning, and he only lived another 5 years, died in 1924. His wife, Blanche, helps out, Blanche Brown, and as his health deteriorates, she starts stepping in and running the paper more. She hired a guy by the name of Thornton Dole, who was the local forest ranger. This is the first bona fide cowboy poet of the Santa Clarita Valley, who tirelessly wrote these beautiful poems about the valley. And he was also on again, off again editor. 1 week it would be a Thornton Dole kind of paper, where there's gunfights and moonshiners captured and just all this, really great, cool stuff to read. And then Blanche would take it over for 2-3 weeks, and it would be back to bake sales.
We were farming country and we were oil country. And those were the things that were in the paper. A lot of the news of the day was Joe and Mary Smith just returned from Los Angeles. Everybody in town had their name in the paper that way.
They had an old-fashioned hand press, a clapper press, where you just put in a piece of paper, and then you slam, the frame shut, and you get your hand out of the way, and then that makes an impression, and then you open it up, pull the paper out.
People often ask, what was the Saugus Enterprise? Because you saw it on the masthead for decades. The Newhall Signal and the Saugus Enterprise. It was apparently a short-lived paper in the early 20s, and it was absorbed into the Signal in December 1924. Dial up the clock a few months, Thornton Dole is out, and Blanche Brown hires a new editor, and his name was A.B. Thatcher. He went by the name Dad Thatcher. Basically, almost a one-man show.
He starts what would become a ritual in the Signal for years, the front page Signal column, where the editor or top columnist would write on the front page.
1938, Blanche sells the newspaper to an outsider, somebody who came in from out of state, named Fred Trueblood.
My grandfather, Fred Sr., brought the family to Newhall in 1938 from Wickenburg, Arizona, where they purchased the Newhall Signal and Saugus Enterprise for $4,000 and had to borrow money to do it. The only news that people had was our paper, and people read it religiously. From Acton all the way to Castaic, and it connected the whole valley. People in Sand Canyon knew what was going on in Castaic in those days, which was not too much. My dad, Fred Jr., worked at the newspaper after he got out of World War II. My Uncle Gus, who was younger, he worked for the paper, and my Aunt Joan did the society page until my mom entered the picture. My mother met my dad when they were getting ready for the Normandy invasion at a USO cantina or some kind of thing. Then my dad got hurt and he came back to California. He just could not get this young English girl out of his mind, and he wrote her letters like many Yanks did after World War II. And of course, California was paved with gold, and my mom just took to it. And when my aunt quit doing the society page, Bobby started doing that, and it was like she was born to do it. She became actually the go-to person in the valley. We weren't a wealthy family in town, but we're a prominent family. When your family has a newspaper, everybody knows who you are. We had an office out front where you could conduct a little business, but in back it was dirty. We had, with linotype machines, we melted lead and made lead slugs.
I wouldn't begin to know how a linotype machine works.
They're incredibly complex. They're made up of thousands of parts. You had a keyboard. It had 90 keys in it. If you pressed a key and held it down, then the magazine, which was up above you here, contained matrices or tiny little molds, each with a letter that you would assemble in a line. And then you would send it up, and the machine took over from there.
The paper came out Thursday morning. We never delivered the papers other than in stacks to liquor stores and grocery stores and places where people frequented. People would come in to get a newspaper. One of the interesting features, it didn't have an editorial section except for my grandfather, then my father later wrote a column called The Tower. And in those days, there was no such thing as political correctness. My grandfather's death was a gigantic moment in our family because he ruled the family with an iron hand. I mean, he was a huge personality in town. My dad worked 70 hours a week when I was a kid, took a half day off on Sunday. Of course, we just thought that's how life was. It was a tough business, tough, physical, draining business. And all the time you had people that were happy with you and the same number of people who were really unhappy with you. You would say that no son of mine will ever work in a newspaper, as long as he was alive. The reason that we sold the newspaper in the early 60s is that they were starting to build tracks here, and the valley was filling up with people. You just couldn't support the community with this old newspaper and its equipment.
Ray Brooks bought it in 1962 from the Truebloods. The building did have a press, a small hot type press, and he pulled out the linotype machines, and he switched to cold type. And he had the signal printed on his presses in Tujunga because he also owned the Tujunga Record Ledger.
Ray just had it for a short period of time. I think he wanted, like a lot of people, you come into a community and think, oh, newspaper, how hard could this be? Ray was an outsider, just like the Newhalls were outsiders when they came here. And it took a little while for them to be part of the fabric of the community.
Ray Brooks, he had owned the paper, I guess, about 6 months, and my father approached him in early '63 and made a deal and bought the paper. Scott and Ruth were a really lifelong newspaper people. He graduated from college and left college, as a matter of fact, in the early Depression in about 1933. And he found a job as a photographer at the San Francisco Chronicle. He knew nothing about newspapers, knew nothing about photography. But a friend of his offered to teach him everything he needed to know and taught him fast. My mother, by her own nature, was a very good writer at the time, and he would call upon her to help him at the newspaper. And she became a part-time employee at the Chronicle. They were in a battle with the San Francisco Examiner, their big competitor, and the Chronicle was in second place and the Examiner was in first place. They had been that way for about 50 years. And Scott said the only way we're going to attract readers is to give them something special to look forward to and to pick up and read the paper. And that's what he did. The Chronicle ultimately gained readership by all this and passed the circulation of the Examiner in about 1958. The only trouble with the Chronicle, while he was very successful there, he was just another employee. And he said, sometimes I'd like to own the paper and not have to put up with petty disputes or petty unions that they had there. And so he knew from his relationship with the Newhall Land and Farming Company that they were planning to develop this area, the Newhall-Saugus area, into a community. And he said, do they have a newspaper down there? And he found out about the Newhall Signal, and he found out that the owner was willing to sell it.
Scott Newhall was a totally different personality. Mr. Trueblood sold newspapers because people wanted to find out what was going on in their valley. And Mr. Newhall sold newspapers because he knew how to sell them. People would complain, it's outrageous, it's not true.
He met a guy in San Francisco who was with the Society Against Indecency to Naked Animals. He said, let's bring him down here. And he surveyed the area and came to the Signal, of all places, to explain that it was incredibly immoral that they would let these naked cows graze in the fields out there where anyone could see them. And they even chartered a little biplane, and they had this guy in the biplane and fly over the valley, especially the fields of the Newhall Land and Farming Company, and drop leaflets and clothes. They would drop these bloomers and stuff. And people thought, this is incredible. This is weird. This is outrageous. But they bought the paper and they read them. And that was the purpose of it.
Scott and Ruth Newhall were two of the fieriest journalists you could ever want to know. I mean, they literally, that paper just sizzled.
He loved to cause mischief. But there was also a very practical side of their journalism, you know, with Scott, Ruth, and Tony, that you get something to attract people's attention.
Ruth used to write a Christmas column every year. It was Ruth Newhall's Christmas poem. If your name didn't get in Ruth's Christmas poem, positive or negative, people were really angry about that.
But then there'd also be really serious stories of things that needed fixing or some wrong that needed righting.
Who could not forget, if they won't slow down, throw the bastards in jail? I think that headline was one of the most controversial things that ever ran. We had bomb threats at the Signal after that editorial ran from angry truckers. It was a very sad story. A trucker on Soledad Canyon who did not have good brakes could not make a stop at the intersection of Soledad and Bouquet Canyon and rear-ended a camper that had children in it. They were going to Magic Mountain. The children were killed. When it was discovered that his brakes were faulty, of course, Scott just went on the warpath with his editorial trying to get some things done for the safety on our roads.
Scott understood that a paper takes a position. Now, I always thought the papers don't take a position. No, the paper has a point of view, and people read that paper to understand or illuminate questions they have regarding this particular point of view.
One of the most interesting events that was held in the 60s was the so-called meeting of the Ku Klux Klan. We heard that they were trying to dredge up some membership here in Southern California, and they had chosen the meeting ground in Soledad Canyon. And Scott was extremely critical of them in his editorials and says you cannot come here and threaten any citizens that are living here. You cannot make a spectacle of it yourselves. The organizer, I think, left after that, and we never heard anything about them locally again. There were several other competitors. The first ones, when Scott came here, was the Sentinel, the Valley News, and Green Sheet. And there was also the San Fernando Sun. When he bought it, the paper was a weekly on Thursdays. And then they changed it in late 1965 to bi-weekly, Thursday and Sunday. And then when he found out that the San Fernando Sun would be coming up to this area, he said we can knock them off if we have a more legitimate publishing schedule. In October 1966, they changed it to Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And then really you didn't hear much of a peep out of the San Fernando Sun.
The Signal was our hometown paper. Two of my boys were paper boys when it was delivered 3 days a week, and they had to go collect money once a month. You could read the LA Times, but it didn't cover us. We did have the Daily News, and it was just a little sliver of our news, but the Signal was all Santa Clarita all the time.
So we had a chance when the Sheriff's Department vacated their building to move to the City Center in 1973. We took over that building and made it our composing room and our advertising sales office. And so we had buildings on two sides of the street. On the south side, it was the main building. On the north side, the old Sheriff's building became our composing room.
There was, I think, 7, 8 desks, just all crammed in there together, and old-fashioned typewriters. And you would type up your stories, and then you would put them in Ruth's little basket. She'd read them, edit them, and then she would call over, and across the street where the old sheriff's office is, the corner of 6th and Main Street today, where the Canyon Theater Guild dressing room is, was the back shop. And that's where you would go over and lay out the paper, on these banks and run the stories through this special film machine. It would come out on this glossy film, and then you dry it, and then you would run it through a hot waxer machine, and then you would cut it out and put it literally on boards and stuff, and then put, the pages together that way.
I remember when Scott and Ruth came to town, they said we have to have a column as someone who talks about society. And who better knew it than Bobby Trueblood, who was the grande dame of this valley, an absolute queen. And she said, I'll gladly be it. So they introduced a column called Look Out for Bobby. And she went to as many parties as she could for the simple reason of getting to know who the people were and then being able to go back and write about it.
My mom, Bobby, and Ruth Scott became best friends, you know. They loved each other. We spent many holidays and many dinners out in Piru, and Skip and Tony and John and I became good friends.
And then at one point, Bobby got fed up. She had a good friend who was in the state legislature named Ed Reinecke. The Signal came out with a very strong editorial saying that Reinecke, who I think was lieutenant governor at the time, about 1970, should be recalled. And Bobby got so mad at that, she resigned.
The Newhall Signal has been my life. It is therefore a most painful thing to read such an atrocious editorial deriding our congressman. The Signal upholds the fact that every man in the true American way has a right to speak his mind, and yet it seems that any man who thinks not along the lines of the Signal relinquishes that right and becomes a target for any small, insignificant, childish jab that the reporters wish to blow up into their journalistic coup of the year.
If you're going to get involved in a community, you have to be involved in the good works of the community that help people, the citizens. And that's why we were involved with what was originally the Newhall Saugus Boys Club, became the Santa Cruz Valley Boys and Girls Club, and the Historical Society, and the same was true for the hospital. The hospital needed support. So several of us were members of the hospital boards and some other things, and with College of the Canyons too.
I was fighting the world's largest garbage dump out here, and I can remember going to the Signal in a little white building up in Newhall on 6th Street, talking to Ruth Newhall, Scott Newhall, and everyone who was at the Signal at that time in the 80s in order to get awareness of what they were trying to put out here in our valley.
Ruth, I know, was very interested and very supportive of the cityhood movement. When we saw that the county would not work, we said the city is the best alternative.
We were trying to form our own county, break away from Los Angeles County, which in 1976 and again in 1978. But you dial up the clock a couple of years, and there was a meeting at the Valencia Hills Clubhouse. Ruth was there, and my mother was there, and other county formation leaders were there. And Ruth said, you know what? Okay, we're not going to be able to form the county, but now we should really look at forming our own city, and here's why. Well, 1987 we did. The timing of it was Ruth's idea.
Scott and Ruth, it was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm in the same room with them. But after you got to know them, they were just regular people. They had their ways of doing things, and it was their way or nobody else's way.
Ruth was like working for Katharine Hepburn. She had that sophistication. She had over 135 IQ. She was very discerning in terms of the diction, sentence structure, and all those things. A stickler for journalistic standards. Like, she would always give her new reporters a skills session in which she would announce at one point during her lecture, in the Signal, people die. They do not pass away. Okay. So you learn from the masters. And Scott was like being hired by Mark Twain or some 19th century larger-than-life figure. And he was so spectacular a presence. And just walking by your desk was an inspiration.
They had a rule back in the 70s that every story over 6 inches had to have a byline. So I was doing sports, and there'd be 8 stories that had to have a byline on the front of the sports page. Well, I'm the only guy working there. So I invented the name Maynard G. Krebs, assistant sports editor. So after about 2 weeks, I get this just nasty single-page typewritten letter from Tony Newhall, and I go, who the hell do you think you are hiring someone like an assistant sports editor without telling me? And he called me into his office, and I just let him go on for 20 minutes, And he said, Tony, Maynard G. Krebs is the fictitious character from Dobie Gillis. I just did it because we needed the different bylines. And I'll never forget, he just like collapsed on his front of his desk, He says, get out of here, get out of here.
Scott and Ruth, they expected to keep it forever. But Scott and Ruth's sons not always disagreed that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives here in Newhall looking after this little paper. The paper was bought by Scott with borrowed money, and he had to make payments to the bank. He decided to make a deal that he would sell the paper to someone who had funds that would pay him now for an option to buy the paper. This happened in 1972. So he did this deal with Charles Morris, who had newspapers in the South. For a loan given now, he would get the option to buy the paper, definitely, in about 6 years, about 1978. Scott said, I'll be about ready to retire in 1978. Well, time changes, and 2 or 3 years later, after he made the deal with Morris, business locally improved tremendously, and the Signal started doing very well. But Charles Morris wouldn't go back on the deal. I can't blame him. So Scott said, I like this paper too much, and so he decided to ask Morris, can I stay on? And Charles said, absolutely, please stay on. Mr. Morris took over, the Morris Newspaper Corporation took over the paper in 1978, and Scott and Ruth stayed on into the 80s.
Although I'd worked in papers, which were mostly white, I had never worked in a facility with a company that was like totally white. Ruth gave me a test and hired me right on the spot. So one of the things that was such a pleasure about working in the Signal is that these were reporters. They were authentic reporters, like Sharon Hormel and Gary Johansson, people like that. You could just see them sniffing out a story. And if there's someone that's on the other line who is the barrier to the truth, oh, they're barracudas. So that whole soup of human energy, it was just very intoxicating, very lovely to be around.
We built our new building in 1986. At that point, we took an older press, a used press, Goss Press, and moved it up into our new building. When we moved into our new building, which was middle of 86, we started printing for the first time in years on our own premises. And finally, there was a major dispute in 1988, and our family decided to pick up stakes and move on and leave the paper in the Morris newspaper's hands.
Basically, Scott moved across the street and started competing with his old paper, which is, isn't that gorgeous? That's just the most beautiful thing, right?
We had to show the Morris Newspaper Corporation that we could be a success at anything. Well, that wasn't true. We found that it's too hard to go up against a major entrenched newspaper. We should have known better. And so they ran it for about 8 months, and then they decided to throw in the towel. I went up north to join the staff of the San Francisco Chronicle, and they went out to Piru to retire.
The longest tenure of ownership would have been under Morris Multimedia. It was a corporation, Morris Multimedia, but it was essentially a guy, Charles Morris, out of Savannah, Georgia. Even though Scott and Ruth had moved on, we were still the community newspaper, and I never felt like we were, the Georgia corporation operating a newspaper in this community. I felt like we were the community newspaper.
We were the lifeblood of the community. I mean, every assignment you can think of, we went out and photographed, anywhere from high school plays to football, basketball games to social events that were going on at the time, and elementary schools. I mean, we were just all over the place.
We had to boots on the ground everywhere. If there was a fire, we were in the middle of it. If there was an earthquake, we were in the middle of it. If there was a flood, we had to get our clothes on and get out there in the rain and the flood. And we had these notepads. We had to get everything down on a piece of paper, and it had to be accurate.
And it was a 24/7 operation. Reporters and editors would come in the morning, and photographers, and start covering the news of the day. We would edit and process the news, put it all to bed by about 11 o'clock at night, and it would go on the press, and the press would be running through the middle of the night, and they would hand it off to circulation at 4 o'clock in the morning, and hopefully it would hit your front porch by 6, and rinse and repeat.
You never knew what was going to be happening when you came in. You come in and get your coffee and say, well, it looks like I'm going to be laying out coffee. And then there'd be a shooting or a fire or, some big scandal come out, and suddenly it was 7 o'clock that night.
The 94 earthquakes, the Signal was totally trashed. I mean, everything was just, there was no power, everything was broken down. But I just did what any photojournalist would do and started shooting. Everybody just worked their tails off.
Tim White, he pulled everybody together, literally put us in his car and drove us to the Antelope Valley Press so we could put out a newspaper the night of the earthquake.
And all the reporters and photographers slept on the floor in my house that first night.
And we never missed a day of publication.
Randy Wicks was the Signal's editorial cartoonist. He was there in the 80s and in the 90s. And even at the time, We were lucky to have a full-time editorial cartoonist. It was a luxury for a paper our size.
Randy Wicks came from Cal Arts, little Iowa farm boy, looked like Meatloaf, the rock singer Meatloaf. He was working in the art department at the Signal and just doing toasters and, this and that, just stuff for ads. And he showed me some of his work and he said, I always wanted to be a political cartoonist. Do you think, Ruth and Scott and Tony would let me?
He was a very, very clever cartoonist. I don't think it stirred up many problems, but it made people at least read the paper and saying, what is this guy Wicks up to now? What's he gonna say now?
Before there was Google, there was Randy Wicks. He read like nobody's business.
Sometimes I'd go in at 8 in the morning and he'd already be in, sitting at his seat with about 7 papers around him.
Randy is like home plate on a baseball diamond. And you always have to have home plate. If Randy had built up a reputation and a tradition of excellence, the wit of his pen, the line that he was able to invoke on the page, not just the content, like whether he's drawing some individual in the Senate, the line that he's using to create that nose or that face, there's wit in that line, just the line itself.
He would make you laugh, he would make you cry, but one of his credos was, at least I made you think.
Randy was only 41, and he had a heart attack, and he died, and it was awful.
Pulling together a paper the same day that you lose a friend, and then you have to turn around and do your job to put out a newspaper that's about that friend in the space of a few hours is incredibly difficult.
The Signal did not replace him when he passed away. There just wasn't anybody else that could do what Randy could do.
Walking into the newsroom was like walking into a little buzzing hive. Someone would call us with a lead. And so we had a newsroom hotline.
You had fewer resources available to you as a reporter. You had what was at your fingertips in hard copy or came over the fax machine or what you could get from talking with somebody on the phone.
One of the requirements was we needed 2.5 stories a day. It was almost like a come to Jesus moment at 5 o'clock when Tim would say, okay, everybody, tell me your stories.
The Signal did hire 2 different kinds of people. They would hire people that were fresh out of journalism school and eager to start something new and were excited at the prospect of covering a growing community like Santa Clarita. But it's important to have a balance of those with institutional knowledge. And you learn from each other.
In the sake of college kids, they come to the Signal as a launching pad to, get their feet wet. Maybe it's their first journalism job, and they're there with the expectation of being there for 6 months or a year, and then they jump to something bigger, and so on.
And we would actually give history lessons, or our editor did, to some of the young reporters. This is what happened with the dam breaking, this is what happened with, the road going through. And so I think because they were young, they gained all that historical knowledge and used it in things they wrote and beyond.
The Signal was my first job out of college. Like anybody's first job, there's what you learn in the classroom and then there's real life. And the Signal was my introduction to the real life of the professional world.
Patty Shea, she had a master's degree in journalism. And she would work all night long on elections and government. And she taught me how important it was to do your research, to have your facts, to get at least 3 sources, to don't take anybody's word for anything unless you can back it up.
In the 90s, I remember I used to go to the state news editors convention every year. And there was a year where the conversation among the editors was, hey, you heard about this internet thing? Yeah, you think you're gonna have a page on that? Yeah, we might. I think we're gonna put our logo on it and everything.
I had a strong belief myself in digital technology and what it could do and where it could take us. But I think we were early adopters and we were well ahead of the other newspapers in our chain. I remember I was very frustrated when I found out the domain name, The Signal, it was already taken. Signal was already taken. So we ended up going the-signal.com and it worked out okay.
So in 1998, Paul Sisson, the IT manager, and I put the Signal online for the first time. People didn't really understand why we were putting the Signal content online and just giving it away. Now, Will Fleet got it. He knew where things were going.
The initial reaction to email was, as I look back on it, was kind of comical because it was more or less looked at as sort of a toy and it wasn't really thought of as a serious tool. In fact, I would say for the first couple of years after we got email, we were still passing each other notes and didn't really realize that the email was a much more efficient way to do it.
This is what they were using in about 98, 99 when I started at the Signal. We were still shooting film then with manual focus film cameras. We developed the film, we had a processor in the darkroom, we still use the darkroom. And then digital cameras, as you know, you can shoot as many pictures as you want, you just change the card. So when these came out, there was no question we were going to stop using film when I was at the Signal. And they never looked back. Then every year they saved $45,000.
A few years after we put the Signal online, we started doing video, about 2001, 2002, somewhere around in there. So the reporters really didn't like the idea of going on camera because I'm not a talking head on NBC or something. I'm a print journalist. But there were a couple who would go along for the ride. Patty Rasmussen was always, she seemed to love to do the stuff in the schools, and so that adapted well to video, which we then ran on SCB-TV.
Nobody wanted to be on camera, but for some reason, I volunteered. So we went to community events, we went to school events, and we had to explain to everyone we were interviewing what the World Wide Web was.
We're always looking for stories that have a human interest connection. And we want to write about people, not things. And so if we are writing about a thing, we want to write about how that thing affects people. And we want to bring it home.
And we started this eclectic entertainment weekly. And it was a tabloid. And it was a lot of fun.
Society and entertainment coverage is critical to a community newspaper because that's the heart and soul of a community. Yes, you have your government coming and going, but the society, the escape, is what keeps people together. It brings people together to see a performance. It brings people together to do a performance, to see your child in their high school choir or your elementary school grandchild dancing on stage for the first time, or to read books that local authors have written.
There was a lot of women, hardworking women. There was 2 Pattys, 2 Stacys, 2 Michelles. We just all kind of helped each other. So when you look at things that we got awards for, you may see a byline at the top, but the tagline at the bottom was 3 or 4 more people.
When Jake Karegian was killed, you saw the newsroom just come alive, and it wasn't one person leading the charge. It was this person was calling the sheriff's department, this person was talking to the homeowners, and then you all come together and it makes this magical creation that you're able to give to the readers.
So in my 27 years with the City of Santa Clarita, I was the communications manager for 11 federally declared disasters. And then there was major issues, such as Ellesmere Canyon, such as the mining project. And every step along the way, we depended upon the Signal newspaper to provide the community with the information that they needed to make decisions, to vote, to show up at an event, to write a letter. Without the Signal, I don't know that we would have been able to move some of these issues forward as successfully as we did over the years.
The contaminated Burbite property in the middle of this city might be built on right now, if not for the investigative journalism that the Signal reporters did 20 years ago in this case.
The very first day that I became publisher of the Signal back in 2004, I had dropped my daughter off at the ice station, and there was this like mini kind of riot. So I called in and asked that the reporter come out and cover it. And it was after 5, it was like 7 o'clock on a Friday, and I was told, well, we didn't have a afternoon reporter. And then I said, well, send a photographer. And I was told, well, after 5 o'clock, Monday through Friday, they don't have an afternoon or weekend photographer. So I built up the staff to make the product better. We're a local paper, we need to cover local news. That's what people are looking for in a community paper.
Morris Multimedia Inc., I actually enjoyed working for them. They were very liberal as far as they let the publisher at hand, kind of run his own business. They would come out every 6 months or so and kind of just check on us. But the downside to that was then if they didn't like what was going on, we lost a publisher every 2 years.
You bring in a new publisher, and every new publisher was this way. They were going to build up the paper and make it the way it used to be. They all said that. They all believed it, and they all strove to do that. They would add new features, they would hire new staff, they would build up the paper. The Morris brass would come out from Savannah, Georgia, and cut. I would be lucky to have 2 reporters in a single day. We always wished that there was some benevolent person, another Ruth and Scott Newhall, who maybe didn't need the money, and who would be willing to reinvest the profits into the business and build it up.
The community newspaper, it's more than a business. It really needs to be owned by the community and not people just trying to make a profit during a short period of time.
I think local ownership is the way to go, especially for this newspaper, in this community. You run into the same people constantly, and unless you live here, you don't understand this community at all.
Another out-of-towner, not as far as Savannah, Georgia, but an out-of-towner named Chuck Champion and some partners purchased the Signal from Morris Multimedia. And so now it had a different owner. Chuck Champion had some ideas for the paper that really actually weren't related to the print product. He had an online product and a video product that he wanted to develop, and he wanted to use the Santa Clarita Valley as a test market, roll them out nationwide. Well, those things didn't happen. And so in really 2 short years, he sold it to Richard Budman. Richard Budman is the first person to own the Signal since Scott and Ruth Newhall, who lives in the Santa Clarita Valley. You've seen him build it up. But the thing of it is, he's building it up on his own dime, not like a past publisher who would try to build it up on Charles Morris's dime.
Richard and Chris Budman, who are the owners right now, it's absolutely marvelous that they're local, that they understand and they know the community.
When Richard called me to tell me he was going to be buying the paper, it sort of sparked something. I didn't realize I'd missed, the news business as much as I did. And this was going to be the start of injecting new life into the Signal.
When Richard came aboard, I think we might have had 4 editorial people, and we're up to over a dozen now. And that's what the community wants. They want the journalism.
Well, my responsibility as the publisher is to give the community a voice. And we try and cover the news as fairly and as honestly without bias as we possibly can.
Any newspaper, I think, first and foremost, needs to be objective. They need to be able to report in an objective manner. And I think the current Signal does that.
It's very important to have the news in the hands of responsible, skilled writers, collectors, and editors.
What we're trying to do now is we're trying to put texture to the news. It's doing community stories, it's covering the nonprofits, it's bringing the community together by telling the positive stories in the community.
I hope this is the story for a lot of community newspapers. But even in today's multimedia environment, you can get all you want to hear about Trump on social media and the national media. You can get all you want to hear about pro sports, but you can't get your kid's soccer score. You can't get what's going on at City Hall. You can't get what's going on with your local school board. It takes community-based resources to cover that news, and that's the news that affects people's daily lives.
There is something special about the Signal, and I think that must have been ingrained. It probably goes back to Scott and Ruth Newhall. They are the ones who probably gave the Signal the DNA that there is something different about it, different and wonderful about the Signal.
I think it goes back to the days of at least Fred Trueblood. And Fred Trueblood and his son, were community leaders. The Signal back in those days was your weekly family photo album. It's like who's born, who's died, we need to support so-and-so. So-and-so needs to be punched in the nose.
The Signal gave me a special identity in the community, and it gave me a career that I didn't know I wanted.
It wasn't an 8-hour a day job. It was a 10 or 12-hour a day job. I think we all want to believe that it really mattered, and that what we did made a difference to this community.
I've been here 40 years. I've read it, I do believe, every day for 40 years.
I get up every day and I read the Signal.
You can't really, as an individual, own a newspaper. I don't think Scott Newhall could own the Signal. Charles Morris couldn't own the Signal. Richard Budman can't own the Signal. The Signal belongs to the community and the people they serve. And they can own the business that supports the newspaper, but you can't really own a newspaper as an individual.
When you've been that closely associated with the Signal, you know, you've got your loves and hates and ups and downs, but at the end of the day, you bleed Signal red. And, you know, we refer to it sometimes affectionately, sometimes jokingly, as the mighty Signal. But it is the mighty Signal. To us, to those of us who've been a part of it, certainly, it is who we are. It is a reflection of what we are. And it runs in our veins.
My writers, they work their butts off. They try the hardest they can every single day. They go out there for very little money to inform the community, and they do it because they love that business.
I put stakes down here. I put my roots down here. I raised my kids here. Care a lot. I cared a lot about this place and this paper, and I think that's what I'm most proud of.
Happy birthday.
Happy 100th birthday.
Happy 100th birthdays.
Happy 100th birthdays.
Happy 100th birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthdays.
Happy birthdays.
Happy 100th birthday.
Happy 100th birthday.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Happy 100th birthday.
Happy 100th birthday.
Happy 100 years.
Happy 100th birthday.
Happy 100th birthday.
To the mighty Signal.
Newhall Signal.
Santa Clarita Valley Signal.
The Newhall Signal and Saugus Enterprise, the proper name in the newspaper.
And I'm happy that the Signal is still here.
Wow, 100 years.
100 years old.
We're really proud that you're 100 years old.
100 years of excellence.
Happy 100 years, you old fart.
Congratulations.
So glad to be a part of your story.
Thank you for everything that you've done.
Good luck with another 100 years.
See you in 100 years.